Hey everybody, my name is John DePietro, and I want to welcome you to another edition of Interesting People. And certainly our guest today, Casey Sherman, is one of the most interesting people you're going to meet anywhere, not only in Massachusetts, Greater Boston, throughout the United States, but Casey is kind of a worldwide entrepreneur and author and promoter. We're going to meet him in just a second, but first what I want you to do is down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little red button that says subscribe. If you'd be kind enough to hit that button, and then after you do that, a little bell will appear. Hit the bell, and that means every time a new episode of this series is released, you'll be the first to get it. So with that being said, let's welcome our special guest and author extraordinaire, Casey Sherman. Casey, welcome to the show that really doesn't have a formal name.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you once again. It's been a while, but you and I stay in nearly constant contact. So good to see you.
Yeah. Well, we can't say constant contact, Casey, because we'll probably, somebody has a copyright on that name and they'll send us a cease and desist letter. But anyway, as you can see behind me, you have a new book coming out called Hunting Whitey. Before we go into the details of the book, give us a little background about your writing history, your work history before you became an author. Yeah. And the other thing I want to ask you is this. I find something very rare in you, that not only are you an author, but you are a promoter. And generally, those two qualities aren't found in the same person.
Well, no, you're right about that. I mean, writers are often introverted people, and I always look at it in a different way. You know, I've got to take off my Ernest Hemingway hat and put on my P.T. Barnum hat and get my work out to as many people as I can. I do that not only for myself, but, you know, the publisher has invested heavily into the project, and they need to know that you're doing everything that you can as an author to really market your book. And so I've always been very hyper-focused on making sure that you know, we get the biggest bang for our buck in every book that I launch and that I'm a part of. And a lot of that does go back to my background, John. You mentioned, you know, I was in the news business for well over 20 years, and I still am to a degree. But I was a television news producer for a lot of the different TV stations, both locally in the Boston area and nationally as well. And I remember I would watch authors come in to be interviewed, and they could barely even get their own names out. And they were just so boring on camera. And I knew, I said, okay, well, you have 1 minute and 15 seconds to really tell your elevator pitch to what your story is. And if you can draw in the audience in that minute 15, you're going to be more likely to sell, you know, 50 to 100 more copies of your book, as opposed to just giving one-word answers. Now, you know, a lot of authors need to really kind of work on their delivery and on their presentation skills. And I think you have to do that in today's environment, because there's so many other books and other forms of media out there that are dominating people's time. So how do you know,
you're competing with a lot of different screens. It used to be the news cycle was get everything on for 6 and 11. And get it into the Sunday Globe and that type of thing. And today people get their information in totally different, you know, fashion.
What you're doing is a perfect example of that, John. So, you know, knowing that I needed to, as a young author, you know, without a lot of experience under my belt, I needed to be able to tell the story in a cohesive and exciting way, and started writing books about 20 years ago now. The first book I wrote was about my pursuit of my aunt's killer in the Boston Strangler case, called A Rose for Mary, which is how you and I first...
Time out for 1 second. Say that again slower, because a lot of people are not really aware of, you just didn't write a book about allegedly Albert DeSalvo. You wrote a book that was personal.
It was very personal. My aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, a Barnstable High School graduate, was the youngest and final victim in this notorious 1960s murder spree. Now, back in the 1960s, 11 women were strangled in a 2.5-year period in Boston from 62 to 64, and no one was ever officially charged with any of the murders. So there were a lot of questions that family members like mine had about the guilt or innocence of the so-called murderer, Albert DeSalvo. And here I come 20 years later as a young journalist with a degree in journalism from Boston University, and I'm starting to peel the onion back in terms of what really happened in the 1960s. And what I found out, which was much more terrifying than somebody like Albert DeSalvo killing 11 women, it was actually several killers committing these murders under the guise of this phantom Jack the Ripper fiend, which really wasn't true. These were personal murders for the most part, men who knew their victims, and the police knew it at the time. And I came, several years later and just dissected the case piece by piece, pointed out the discrepancies to the official original investigation. And, the book A Rose for Mary became a surprise bestseller. And I think a lot of that was based on my ability to articulate the story in a very personal way. And after that, John, I said, I can do this. There are other stories that I can tell.
Right. So moving right on to Whitey. Casey, if you Google search Whitey Bulger, there are several books that come out.
Yeah.
They appear there. Why you? Why now? And what's the difference between this book and everything else that is?
Great questions, John. And one of the reasons I resisted in terms of ever writing a book about Whitey Bulger is based on what you just said. I didn't want to go over anybody else's old material. That's not enticing to me or exciting to me as a journalist and a storyteller. Now, I lived in South Boston in the early 1990s at the height of Whitey Bulger's crime spree. I lived at 10 Thomas Park, right down the street from John Connolly. My next door neighbor was in Whitey's gang. I had met Whitey Bulger on occasion, and I had these anecdotal stories about Bulger that might fit for an interesting magazine piece, but certainly wouldn't fit for a book. And again, I didn't want to, go over anybody's old material. But then Whitey Bulger is killed at a place called Misery Mountain, which is the Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia. And I started to look at, along with my co-author Dave Wedge, writing the final chapter to Bulger's story, which has never been told. What was he doing during the 16 years that he was on the run? What happened to him inside those prison walls, not just at Hazleton, but all the other prisons that he was in as well? And we tell the story in a completely fresh and new and unique way. And more importantly, we got embedded with not only the FBI team that finally captured Bulger, but we got embedded with many of the prisoners that Bulger interacted with every day, including Freddie Gius. Now, that name should ring a bell to people that have covered or understand the Whitey Bulger story, because he's the prime suspect in Bulger's murder. And we got exclusive access to Freddie Gius while he's been in solitary confinement at Misery Mountain.
So people are going to read and be made aware of issues that have heretofore never been presented publicly. Is that correct?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I was resistant to go over all the old Whitey Bulger stories. We had to touch upon them just to put his criminal career into context. But this is a story about, in two phases, a gangster in his lion and winter phase of his life. Again, those years that he's on the run, his body is breaking down around him. He's connected to his girlfriend, who at first is somebody that he doesn't care a lot about, but obviously has to depend on because, he's becoming older and older. And then you've got the FBI side of things. And everybody knows the John Connolly story and how Bulger co-opted the FBI in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. Well, fast forward to the mid-2000s. You've got these young FBI agents, and they're working in the Boston office, and all they hear about are the ghosts of that office's past. And they're smeared, because of that office's connection to John Connolly. These people don't know who John Connolly is. They never worked with him. And they decided amongst themselves, with the leadership of a female FBI agent named Noreen Gleason, we're going to go out and we're going to find Bigfoot and we're going to bring him to justice. And that's what they did.
Exactly what they did. So, Casey, the book is going to be available soon. I guess May 26th is the time frame when it's going to be available on Amazon. But I'm told that it's pre-orderable. Is that correct? You can order it now, so when it does ship,
you can order it now. Exactly. So you can order it now on Amazon, and it'll arrive right to your doorstep on May 26th when the book is released. Now, not only is there incredible fresh content, in the book itself, because Dave Wedge and I were the only journalists to ever get access to Whitey Bulger's apartment in Santa Monica, California. So we bring you inside Bulger's hideout like no other reporters have ever done in the past. We also have the last photos of Whitey Bulger alive inside prison. So, you get a very visual perspective of what Bulger's life was like during those final days. That really powerful narrative as well.
Great. So, Casey, we want to thank you so much. We don't want to give away everything that's in the book. We want people to buy the book and then communicate back to you, because today, as an author, you do have the capability to get feedback instantly from people that have bought the book, and that must make you feel special that people are spending time getting back to you.
Sure, and no matter what their response is, I've been very lucky in my career that all of the critical reviews of my books have all been positive. But then you get the customer reviews that sometimes have their own. They provide their own perspective to their review, and I read them all, and sometimes some of them I agree with, some I don't. But as an artist, it's all about eliciting an emotion in the person that's either reading your work, mesmerized by your painting or listening to your music.
Great. So Casey Sherman is the author. The book is called Hunting Whitey. It will be available on Amazon and I'm sure at bookstores everywhere starting on May 26th. Casey, we want to thank you so much for spending time with us to tell us all about your latest book.
Thank you, John.
Have a great day, everybody.